Last week we talked about the parable of the unforgiving debtor. And a couple of things happened this week to remind me of it and to make me return to it. One of the reasons is that last week's sermon, maybe that's why we don't have as many people here today. Last week's sermon ran a little long because there was a lot to say about that business. I spent so long on the introduction that the sermon really went too long. But I had a conversation this week with a man which brought it all back to me. He was talking about a time when he was going into a mall and it was crowded. He was looking for a parking place, and finally he spotted a fellow who was going to go out in his car, but he delayed, and he thought the man went to his car. What happened? So he drove just past the car and said, oh yeah, the man's still in the car, and he stopped there, ready to wait for the man to back out, and then he would back up and go in. Well, when the man backed out, a pickup truck came down from the other direction and knocked into the parking place before he could back up and go in, and he was very irritated. And he told me that he thought very seriously that something ought to happen to that man's tires. They ought to go flat somehow. He got out of his car when the man had parked and had some words with him, which was his first mistake as a Christian. But because the words were not pleasant, the man basically gave him a rude gesture and just proceeded on into the mall. So then he thought about what he would do to the car, or if he would just leave a message on the windshield. None of it was good, folks. None of it was good. And I couldn't help laughing as he was telling me all these things, because it just seemed so strange that he, whom I know to be an intelligent man, a thoughtful man, a decent man, would even have these thoughts running through his spirit. That getting back at that guy really just rose up in him. And I told him, look, Jesus gave you a very clear prescription on what to do about that. He says, do good to those who despitefully use you. Pray for those who abuse you. What you should have done is left him a stick of gum under his windshield wiper, or just a gift of some kind, or at least write a note saying, I'm very sorry that I was angry with you, that I shouldn't have done that. I'm a Christian, and I want you to know that I don't hold anything against you, and I hope you have a wonderful day, or something like that. But we both laughed, but it's not really entirely funny, because we do have these thoughts sometimes rise up in some of us, and that's what our whole Christian faith is about, preparing us for incidents like that. Because life is full of incidents like that, large or small. There are little irritations or big irritations. And God is preparing us for what to do about them, because if everybody gets back at everybody for everything, the world is a slaughterhouse. And if everybody just forgives everybody immediately for anything, whatever happens, then the world is peaceful. And that's what God is asking us to do. He's asking us to spread peace. Last week, the sermon came in the context of the quarrels that the disciples were having about who was the greatest. You remember, 3 of them had been up on the mountain with Jesus, Mount of Transfiguration, Peter, James, and John. And they came down to find the other 9 had been having trouble with a healing, hadn't been able to do anything for the son of a man whose son was in trouble. Well, that was obviously the scene for a little, between the disciples about, well, Jesus took us up with him, he didn't take you guys. And of course not, you're pitiful. You could just see how the discussion easily arose, and Jesus found them discussing who was the greatest. And he, at that point, took a child, physically, he didn't just talk about children, took a child, put the child down in the midst of them, and explained again, hey, whoever becomes like this little child, whoever makes himself little like this little child, that's the greatest among you. And then he goes on to tell this parable about the king with a servant, and it's all exaggerated. It's hyperbole. It's a festival of hyperbole. The king has a servant who owes him, the figure given there is 10,000 talents, which amounts to the equivalent of $2 million. Well, now what king has a servant who owes him $2 million? And just says, well, that's okay. Cool. The servant says, oh, I'm so sorry, I'll pay it back. Oh, well, all right. I'll just forgive you the debt. That'll make it easy. That doesn't happen. Then the servant goes out and catches another guy by the throat who owes him a tiny debt, 100 pennies. 100. And he just throttles him and treats him very badly. Then the word gets back to the king. Then the king cancels the forgiveness in the parable. Now this is obviously not telling you how God behaves. Right? There's some exaggeration going on here. But to make a lesson, to make a point. The king cancels the forgiveness and throws this guy into jail. And then Jesus says, now, let that be a lesson to you about your relationships with each other, because you all owe something to God. It's much more specifically taught and precisely taught in the Sermon on the Mount, in the Lord's Prayer, which ends up saying, forgive us our sins, our debts, our trespasses. All the same thing, basically. As we forgive those who owe us anything, our debtors, those who trespass against us, those who sin against us. And then at the end of that prayer, Jesus, after he's finished teaching them, says, he preaches a little 20-second sermon on it. 20-second sermons are wonderful, but it's very difficult to preach effective 20-second sermons, so I take about 20 minutes or more. But Jesus preached this little tiny sermon. He says, the reason I'm teaching you this prayer is because if you do not forgive other people for what they do to you, you will not be forgiven by your Father in heaven. Now, some say, well, that's unreasonable. That's a salvation by works. No, it's not. There's always been a tension within the Christian church of people who say, well, you're saved by doing good. Doing good is important. What's really important is doing good, not what you believe. And other people say, no, it's what you believe. Salvation by faith alone, apart from works. And James settles that argument very nicely by saying, look, you show me your faith without your works, I'll show you my faith by my works. And what's true is that when you have the right attitude, your life